Today's panel will discuss the role of industry, the financial, operational, and technical challenges for industry, the federal government's role of funding innovation in cybersecurity R&D, and assuring that the new solutions do not introduce new vulnerabilities into the supply chain. We ask you as the audience to consider what is your role as industry leaders, where are we going, and what opportunities exist to profit from this next wave of cybersecurity. Kilty, back to you.
Great, thanks, Jason. With that, I'd like to introduce our three panelists. First is JC Herz, who is currently COO of Ion Channel, a cybersecurity platform that allows organizations to risk manage and provide continuous and automatic security assurance around their software code. She's a highly regarded veteran of the defense and intelligence communities, having served as a White House special consultant and having advised the Pentagon and the Defense Advanced Research Programs Agency. JC is also recognized for authoring key parts of the Pentagon's cybersecurity acquisition and procurement policies. She also co-leads a Commerce Department working group on software bills of material to facilitate supply chain transparency in critical infrastructure and regulated industry.
It's good to be here.
Welcome, JC. Next, I'm also pleased to introduce Sean Plankey, who just finished up his term as the Principal Deputy Assistant Secretary for Cybersecurity, Energy Security, and Emergency Response at the U.S. Department of Energy and is currently Director of Cyber Missions at DataRobot. At CSER, Sean led energy sector engagement, preparedness, and response activities, including overseeing the $95 million R&D budget for cyber and physical security for the U.S. energy sector. Before joining the DOE, Sean served on the National Security Council as Director for Maritime and Pacific Cybersecurity Policy. He has also served as Global Cyber Intelligence Advisor for British Petroleum and as the Deputy Chief Information Officer for U.S. Navy Intelligence. Welcome, Sean. And rounding out the panel is Clif Triplett. Clif is a senior cybersecurity industry expert, having spent more than 30 years advising the federal government and the largest U.S. corporations across aerospace and defense, manufacturing and tech, utilities and communications, and oil and gas. A West Point grad with a master's in computer science, Clif spent the first decade of his career in the cyber defense and operations of U.S. nuclear command and control systems. Over his post-military career, he led the transformation of GM's manufacturing, was CIO of Baker Hughes, and Vice President and General Manager of Motorola Global Systems. Clif was selected as Presidential Executive Fellow by the Obama administration to help remediate systemic cybersecurity risk across the federal government. He's currently Executive Director for Cybersecurity and Risk Management at Kearney, consulting with governments and major industries on the changing landscape of technology and cyber threats. He also provides technical, strategic direction for StealthPath, a zero-trust cybersecurity and operations integrity product and services company. Welcome, Clif, and thank you, everyone. And now, Jason, the floor is yours.
Thanks, Kilty, again. Well, Pan, I'm definitely looking forward to this discussion here. There are dynamics within industry that make for particular challenges in the field of cybersecurity. Let's explore some of these. Clif, within the security team, turnover and access to quality human capital is a major issue. The average tenure of a chief information security officer is about 26 months. We've seen organizations struggle to staff their cyber personnel. How do we deal with the labor force challenge?
Well, I think the labor force challenge is one of the bigger challenges currently facing us in cybersecurity. We're looking at a major labor shortage. I mean, when I joined the government, we saw that we were just in the federal government forecasting over 1 million people in the US over the next almost 48 months. You take a look at it on a global level, we're talking about 3.5 million unfilled positions. And this is really causing a problem and a demand for talent and even the assessment of what talent we have, and it's driving up the salary of this security professional. And what this is really forcing us to do is look at solutions that are perhaps less complicated, because we're just not going to get the fully skilled person, and we're going to become more reliant on automated tools, again, because of the shortage of personnel. Back to you.
Just to echo that,
Yeah.
I think that when we have too little talent and we have a huge job, that's when we start to see the need for automation, right? And this is where a lot of the innovation goes, right? Is if you have a ditch and people are busy digging it with spoons, you need some self-driving earth-moving equipment. And I think that's what a lot of the companies like StealthPath and Ion Channel and others are endeavoring to do now. And this is the opportunity, is there's never going to be enough labor. Well, you can pray and light many candles. It will not come. And so we now need to start thinking about how to automate and modernize some of these processes so that they can move at machine speed, and so that we can close the OODA loop, right? Observe, orient, decide, and act. And the tighter and the faster we can make those loops, the more responsive and resilient we can be.
Sean, did you have anything you wanted to add there?
Yeah, I just think back to when we think about like when I was starting my cybersecurity, everything was about like what's going on, like what's on the network. We had no visibility, like we didn't know, and so we built all these capabilities that were about getting awareness. And now we just created, now we have a lot of awareness. In most of it, it's just that. But the fire hose is just hitting that side. If you look at the federal contract trends right now, all of the predicted contracts in 21 are majority of them are about busting seats, right? More people in the top. And that's because we're overwhelmed. We're overwhelmed with the data set. So moving to SOC 2.0, 3.0 thoughts, we have to move to that automation and shift to machine learning, triage, auto route, or alerts.
Hey, Sean, we're having a little bit of issues with your microphone. You want to tap it a little bit and maybe that will help it?
Sure. Yeah.
Much
Better?
improved. Yeah, you want to tell us that again?
That was weird. Yeah, so I was just saying, like, everything was about getting all the data, right? Originally, getting awareness, right? Getting network flow, net flow, getting alerting, understanding what was going on. And now that we understand, or we don't have 100% visibility, but we have better visibility, now we're just overloaded. And I was just saying, if you look at like federal contract predictions for 21, the majority of them are asking for more butts in seats because they're overloaded with those alerting. And I mean, they're just not getting to the alerts that are coming up, and we're not being responsive. So there's two ways you can go there. One, you can either be preventative and try to do things in your architecture and your design that reduces the number of alerts that you'll even see, or two, you need to automate and bring machine learning and AI into your response side of the house. So those are the two paths that we have to start walking down.
I think that there's an analogy to logistics, right? So when you want to know where your package is, FedEx doesn't call around to see where it is and daisy chain between people. There's a system in place that's instrumented that gives you transparency. And so if you look at some of these hacks, if you look at Pinellas County, right? So now we're talking about health and safety with water quality and things that are toxic, possibly working their way into the water supply. In this case, there was a human being who was watching cursor move around on the screen. And if the hacker had been just a little bit better, that wouldn't have worked. And so when we start to talk about instrumenting our systems, this is really the next generation of having enough visibility and transparency on our operations, as well as on our supply chain, to be aware, to take action, and to be accountable for what's going on.
So, JC, whether we're talking about the manufacturer or the prime government contractor, the organization's cybersecurity posture is really dependent upon its subcontractors and its vendors. Can you share with us what can be done to improve the security risks coming from our teaming partners?
Right. So we're moving in from, the old hacks. It used to be a guy with a thumb drive, right? And then it was a DNS attack. And now it's stuff that's coming in through the supply chain. And there has been a huge amount of focus through a couple of administrations on supply chain, starting with ICT and telecom. And there's an executive order that is impending about supply chain transparency. In the domain where I work, which is software supply chain transparency, there's both a regulatory push and a market pull for things like software bills and materials, right? So that's like the food ingredients label. What is in your product? And no one debates that food safety is important, right? And we're starting to agree that this label needs to be there, and that we actually need to monitor the status, the vulnerability status of what's in there. In terms of regulatory push, we have executive action. There's also legislative mandates. And also, the FDA just mandated if you want approval for a medical device on a go-forward basis, you need a software bill of materials. So now this is billions of dollars. And so we're working now with manufacturers like, Abbott and Philips and Thermo Fisher and Medtronic to figure out what does it mean to produce one of these things. And then on the consumer sides, the hospital systems, what does it mean to consume them and to monitor them? And so we're all going into this kind of trust but verify regime where before you relied on a supplier to inform you that there was a vulnerability, but don't worry, we've patched it, but that's not good enough anymore. So a bank, before it will procure any software product, the big banks will say, okay, give us a software bill of materials, and if you can't, we won't buy your product, or we'll immediately demand a 40% discount to reflect the increased cost of assurance. And then they'll monitor that. So the supplier now knows, oh, geez, the customer is going to know when there's a critical vulnerability in a component that we're using. And then we might be held to a security service level agreement. So not only do they know, the customer now says, like Mayo Clinic, well, if you pop a critical in your device, you got 30 days to fix it. And if you don't, here's some remedies in our contract. And this is where it becomes very real to suppliers and very real to the investors in those suppliers. And so the transparency allows a whole new regime of third-party risk management, procurement, and vendor management, because cyber is now a part of third-party risk management. And on a company level, we're working on some highly differentiated technologies and business models to automate that compliance, which we'll look forward to discussing further at a later date.
Yeah, I think I definitely like where JC was going, and it's spot on with everything you're saying. The thing that I think about on top of that is if I'm an organization, if I'm a Fortune 100 or Fortune 500 company, I think to myself, like, am I organized the right way to even capitalize on that, right? I was thinking a lot of the organizations I worked in, the CISO reported to the CIO, who reported to the CFO, but the CISO would be called in to present to the board and to the CEO level, and the CISO wants that assurance, right? Wants that compliance that we're talking about, but the CIO wants things cheaper and faster, and the CFO definitely wants things cheaper. So when we think about security, which is neither fast and not always cheap, right? It's diametrically opposed to the wants of your boss. I mean, I think to go back to the first point, Clif was saying, like, that's why CISOs leave after 18 months, right? Like they say, hey, we need to make these changes. We want to move in this direction, and it's like, that's not cheap or fast enough. There
is a point though with certain kinds of agility where good and fast does become cheap. So if you have a high-speed engineering team, I think we're going to start to see customers rack and stack their suppliers by their security response time, right? So mean time to remediation, when something goes wrong, how long does it take these guys to fix it? And if you have data on that, you can start to rack and stack your suppliers on their response time. It costs those fast responders less to respond than it costs the slow responders to respond because of all their legacy, which Clif will get into in a second.
Yeah.
And this is what we're going to learn.
I just want to build on, I think, a real important point that, you talked about, I saw a couple of things here I just want to build on, but one of the big challenges I usually get asked to participate or consult on, whether that be a government or a Fortune 1, is the problem's so big. I only have so much money. I only have so much time. Where do I start? How do I focus? And it really comes down to a little bit of sorting. And the first thing you got to sort on, what's really important? What are the core business processes I need to support? And then from that, which are those critical suppliers, and what is it if they do that I have to prioritize? And then I really need to wrap around the protections. Now, when I was General Motors, Fortune 1, and I had this kind of accountability, I couldn't go to the board and say, one of my little suppliers failed. No, it was on me. And so I think this is the other thing. The larger corporations are going to be accountable. I mean, we're already seeing in legislation, you can't go point at some guy down the food chain that that's why and all the liability should fall on them. No, they start with the big guy and they work down. And I think as a big guy at General Motors, I went to my supply chain, which varied greatly depending on who they were and where we were in the world, what was the risk, and then I had to figure out a risk mitigation strategy. Usually it started off with an isolation strategy, but it also meant I need to have more visibility into my supply chain. What was the risk in there? And how can I extend my visibility in there without causing harm or risk to their operations? So that challenge that existed a number of years ago is even more so today.
And it's moving into software as well, right? So that software bill of materials that, our customers in finance and healthcare are now asking for, this is pre-procurement. So they'll kick over a software bill of materials to us and we'll analyze it. And they can have a conversation with their supplier or that sales guy to say, okay, we love your product. The CIO is crazy about it. But from a security perspective, this is not ready for prime time and we are not willing to assume this kind of risk. So in order to speed time to sale here, you're going to want to bring this up to code and keep it. And that's the basis of an ongoing conversation now, which actually makes things easier from the CISO perspective, from the security perspective, to have that gating function right at the edge of an organization pre-procurement, because once it's brought up to code, then you can monitor to say it stays in code. And third-party risk management, which is a really kind of boring corner of enterprise, is now becoming like the hot spot because this is the velvet rope for cyber.
I'll agree with that statement. I mean, certainly we've seen time and time again where the compliance piece is the victory as opposed to the security piece. Sean, the system is so busy responding to incidents that they rarely have time to see organized R&D. They're dealing with their own organization's advancements of their own code, right? And so they're not out there looking at new technologies or doing continuous training. So you headed the Department of Energy Cybersecurity R&D. I'd love to hear about that. And then I'd also love to hear about, how do you get your technologies into the hands of the private sector?
Sure. So a couple different thoughts. Right off the bat, when we were at Caesar, I thought a lot about where is the least served, and the reason that we thought about this was a lot of times when people think of security, they want to secure the president, right? They want to secure the CEO of the company, the head shed office, and I always go back to, I'm like, sure, that person's valuable, but who has the key to every room in the building? The janitor does, right? So the access point, if you want to, let's say to use a cyber term, gain root access, right, is to go through the super user, which is the janitor, right? So when we think about the electric grid, the energy sector, who actually has a large swath of access, but not that much security? And we thought about the municipalities, right? The electric and water providers that provide large swaths of distribution of electricity across America, right? So like, for instance, in San Francisco, the municipality actually provides all the water and all the electricity to all the residents and businesses in San Francisco. LA is the same way, right? So think about that. Those are massive, massive amounts of millions and millions of people, and they're actually provided by municipalities. So knowing how we pay teachers and school systems and how we fund them, we're always saying, no, I don't want to pay any more taxes. Well, if the taxes are paying the municipality and it's a rate controlled, and it's also a rate controlled environment, like, do you think that, you know, you're buying that top tier cybersecurity investment? You're not. And generally, I used to use this analogy all the time. The guy that mows the lawn on Fridays is also your IT guy, who's also your cyber guy.
Right.
So when we think about that, that's where we started. We said, hey, we need to think about R&D that serves that guy, because that's the back door to the greater electric grid and to have mass effects on millions of Americans. So we look for solutions there, and that drove us to, you know, what type of capabilities were we thinking of? Well, if you look at the ransomware attacks in America that have happened in municipalities, you know, many of them, the network is a very flat network. So you have IT systems and OT systems on the same network. So thinking about that convergence and saying, how can we provide autonomous or let's say self-defending R&D solutions that can self-segregate or provide barriers against the IT and the OT environments from converging, so that an action on one doesn't impact the other. Trying to provide some level of isolation and resiliency. We thought a lot about, you know, how can we have deployable solutions that don't need a constant connectivity, a constant update, that don't need or need minimal man on the loop, right? Human on the loop to self-sustain and to protect themselves. And like in the municipality, we recognize, like, they can't necessarily defend themselves against the APTs of, you know, Russia or China, but can they at least throw an alert or help the municipality provider in the state or the National Guard or, you know, CISA, DHS and CISA say, throw an alert and say, hey, I need some help here, right? Like, I'm reaching a consequence level that's going to have a significant impact on my populace. Can I throw a flag and say, guys, come check on me, render assistance, right? Render aid.
Well, and also leverage, Sean. I mean, I just met with like 50 rural telcos, and their biggest complaint was, yeah, we know there's vulnerabilities in the vendor solutions, but when our little tiny telco says that they should fix it, they tell us to pound sand. So
Right.
I think that when you start to get some of this supply chain transparency and the larger customers and some of the regulators are requiring that this stuff get patched, I think there's a whole bunch of municipal benefit as well, because, you know, they don't just patch the product for the big customer. And so as we achieve these levels of supply chain transparency, I mean, a lot of these municipalities, some of them have really good people and they know there's problems and they have no leverage. So the revolution in procurement and, you know, different kinds of transparency, and I think we mentioned the industry ISACs, the Information Security and Analysis Centers, and ISALs, right? Those become really important, because when these regulated sectors start to speak with one voice about the need to not have critically vulnerable open source components in vendor solutions, and that's a procurement issue, that's when stuff starts to change.
Yeah, I just want to, on that, if I could, you know, I had the opportunity to participate in a couple of different ISACs. I participated in oil and gas and also the health industry. And I think back to Jason's original question is, how do we get the information out there? I saw it in two different ways that haven't been addressed. You take a look at the smaller agencies. There's about 200 agencies in the federal government, and there's about 20 that are of sizable size with CIO and security staffs and all that. And what I found is the smaller agencies, they weren't getting the word either. The larger agencies perhaps have labs, the technology gets into the labs, but how do we get it to the rest of the people? And so what we have to do is, the people trying to get the technology, and I was called by a number of senators saying, hey, how do we get our technology into the federal government? Well, the first place is the labs. And then the government itself has to figure out how to share among itself to the smaller agencies. So we were when I was there, I was looking to be like a foster parent to Justice and some other groups to help share with them and bring them into that communications loop. So I still think there's a weakness in the federal government of sharing to the smaller agencies. But the ISACs is a great way that, JC mentioned for that sharing between the government and industry, and it's two-way. The industry kind of communicates the reality check. This is what we can do. Okay, this is what we need from you in order to do what you're asking of us. And sometimes they take leadership. I know oil and gas was trying to take leadership and communicate up. The health was more like looking for guidance and wanting to be more informed. But when I would sit in an oil and gas ISAC, it was really a team sport. We had Homeland Security there, we had FBI, local law enforcement, and we were sharing in real time attack information, intelligence, and such, and it was super valuable. And the same thing was taking place in the health industry. So it's one of the best places for that two-way exchange to take place. And the most effective are two-way exchanges. They're not just from the government, but they're from this private sector going to the government of the feasibility and needs of their particular industry.
And the industries, they share amongst themselves as well. I mean, we see, some of the health provision organizations that we're engaged with, which, by the way, have much more stringent security requirements than any government agency or even military program. I would stack the Mayo Clinic up against any weapon system any day. But they're looking at, what is the vulnerability profile of these devices, right? Because they're exposed. They have patients and their families and all their devices walking the hallways. They have no physical access control, right? Imagine that. They don't have gates and guards, right? They have to let everyone in. And so their level of vigilance and the amount of data that's now starting to be shared both within the ISACs and then just in some of these proof of concepts and it's very constructive, right? They'll go to a big medical device manufacturer and say, okay, confidentially, here's our findings, and how do we work together to address this? But the enterprise now, whether it's a healthcare or energy, oil and gas, like you say, they own the risk. And they're not, the smart ones are not waiting necessarily to start to get their heads around what that means on a rolling basis. And like you said, it's a team sport. There needs to be collaboration. But from what we've seen in, the very smart financial services, healthcare, energy, transportation, our customers, they're not the people who are going to have, yeah, we're from the government, we're here to help. They are on it. They are deeply engaged right now. And so there actually is a lot of traction right now on information sharing. And I think there's a lot of hope. And it looks complicated and hairy and gnarly, and it is. But that also means there's huge opportunity if you're taking the right approach and if you're using, your talent wisely and automating instead of just putting butts in seats.
So Sean,
real quick.
Yep.
Yeah, so I wanted to talk about two ways, like the inside baseball of how that's actually going to get done with the federal government right now. To reinforce the same things that Clif and JC are saying, the government is doing a few different things. And when I was at DOE, we started an effort to put an MOU between us and EPA. And why EPA? Well, EPA is the sector-specific agency under PPD 21, Presidential Policy Directive 21, for providing the security to water facilities around America, right? Wastewater and drinking water. All EPA is supposed to do that. Well, EPA has 6 people that are there to do cyber. 6, right? So they don't really serve the 4,000 municipalities that are out in America in that regard. They just don't have the capacity. But they still have the responsibility in the accountability under PPD 21. The president has said that, and that's from 2013, right? So two things are happening. One is the White House has recognized that PPD 21 is now approaching 10 years old. Things have changed. We need to rewrite. They're rewriting it right now. It's going to come out that instead of sector-specific agencies, there's sector risk-specific agencies now, and it's focused more on the risk aspect, and that builds off of the National Risk Management Center concept that sits inside of CISA. And they say, well, now we're going to start mandating more of what these agencies will engage with. Like, what is CISA going to do versus what is Cybercom going to do versus what are the 16 critical sectors going to have responsibilities and have to do. And they recognize that a lot of that falls on the states. Like Clif said, the smaller agencies and the state and at the state level or regional level that the federal government just doesn't see. So the thought process right now is, how do we get that funding distributed out? Like, how do we get, you know, the massive infrastructure funding distributed out? And it's actually looked at about using post 9/11. We did port security grants and we did counterterrorism grants for security around America. Now that's how you see that, you know, small town Kansas actually has an MRAP for their PD.
As
but
one
the
does.
concept of how do we distribute the funding levels down is through these federal public-private partnership grant programs, right? That's how the money is going to be dispersed. And so DHS is already currently working on the criteria for the cybersecurity grant program, saying X amount of this grant application has to include cybersecurity. We want it to be focused on these criteria, some of which were mentioned, you know, by JC and Clif today. That's the methodology that they're looking at about how do we help the rest of the community start to protect the critical sectors.
And there's some lessons learned. So I co-chair a Department of Commerce group on software transparency. And so one of the lessons learned is that, you know, the US government has a lot of experience doling out money to build things that are innovative, but then are unmaintainable, right? Because they were built as R&D and there was never any funding to actually maintain them on a rolling basis. And as I like to say, software ages like milk, not like fine wine. So the minute you stop maintaining it, it starts to crumble from underneath you. And so part of the new and hopefully lesson learned is that we have to have these capabilities that build resilience, not just more attack surface. Because if we start doling out tens of billions of dollars to build great innovation, but there's no way to make sure that it's actively maintained, we're just building more attack surface. And so it's not a capital good, it is a variable cost. So we actually have to fund resilience, not just innovation, and make sure that our capabilities are kept green instead of being allowed to just corrode.
So we've gone through some kind of time warp here and have reached, you know, about 30 minutes of panel really quickly. You know, let's move it into the wrap-up phase of the role of the U.S. investor. You know, what should the audience take away as a call to action, JC?
So the investor on a private sector basis, I think that we really have to start to think about cyber due diligence as part of our due diligence, because I don't think there's a lot of people who want to be, you know, principal investors in, you know, the next SolarWinds.
Right.
And we can hold those companies to account. I think on the government side, there's a real calculus that has to go into sort of build versus buy, and that the government is realizing how expensive build can be when it takes, you know, a team of, you know, 20 defense contractors to maintain it. It's not so inexpensive. So I think from private investors, you know, we really have to think much more seriously about holding our portfolio companies to account. And then on a public sector level, we really have to start building some security level agreements for service into our capabilities to make sure the people who maintain them are keeping us from being exposed.
Cliff, did you want to add thoughts there?
Yeah, I think the first one is security's not optional. It's now like almost like breathing for a corporation. You're going to have to put in security. You're going to have to think about it for operational integrity. The other thing with it comes liability. I mean, that's one of the reasons, even if it wasn't just for keep my factory open, it's the liability it might represent in terms of safety or anything else that we see, privacy. There's so many more laws and governance coming out about that. And this is where that partnership between government and private sector becomes very critical. And I think the last piece I want to put out is, we still have that talent issue that I kind of opened up with, that these solutions have to be near real time because cyber moves at the speed of light, and they have to be similar and more intuitive and capable of themselves, which brings us back into the application of things like behavioral analysis and AI, because we just don't have the talent, the sufficient talent. And even if we had the talent probably be able to respond quick enough. So this is a real opportunity for innovation. The requirements there, the innovation demand is there, and I think you're going to see a continued growth in spending in the area of cybersecurity.
And Sean, did you want to add there?
Yeah. So, if I'm thinking of an investor, right, I want to do, software as a service with a big fat ARR and let it grow, because that's very scalable for me. The problem that I see, like right now, a lot of that investment and that thought process is focused on solutions that are cyber attack happens. What do I do now? Right. It's incident. It's post incident. It's recovery. And the place that it's not in prevention, and it's not in the resiliency aspect that JC talked about, right? So if I'm thinking about, where can I invest and still keep that SaaS model with an ARR, I need to look at things that provide resiliency and or prevent, right? Like I would move out of the incident response market in my
100%, Sean.
Yeah.
So we tell folks all the time when we run the assessments, which we do as SaaS, there's some findings. You're not going to like them for now. There's some things that aren't critical vulnerabilities. They aren't high vulnerabilities. They're not known vulnerabilities yet, but they're absolutely things we should look at, because 6 months from now, that's going to be a vulnerability, right? That's going to be a tooth cavity. And they don't like it when the findings come back. But what we've managed to do is scrub 80% of the vulnerabilities that will happen in the future, so that they're not in fire drill mode. And that's what the smart people are all doing, because the fire drill, the incident response with the talent shortage that we have, it's high stress, it's overwhelming, and it's actually demoralizing. It burns people out.
Yep.
So if you can actually do this work preventatively, and we're really bad as human beings at doing that, with our health and our cyber health. But if you can enforce it from the top down, that these are risk indicators you got to scrub out, you can save yourself down the line. And we have the technology to do that.
All right, well, that was awesome, everybody, and definitely appreciate your insights there. Ian, are there any questions that, as we move to open Q&A?
Thanks, Jason, and absolutely. We do have time for a couple of questions here in the few minutes that we do have. As a reminder to the audience, you can submit them by clicking that question mark icon on your screen. Anything we can't get to right now, we will make sure that those questions are answered after today's broadcast. And jumping back to Sean, one question. President Biden keeps emphasizing the need for expanding federal R&D. We know that there exists a high demand for these technologies. Why is it so hard for government to deploy these technologies? And also, what are the goals for assisting agencies in discovery to security? Can you briefly comment on that?
Sure. And actually, this is a great one for Jason to talk about too. But one of the problems is technology. Yeah, everything dies in the chasm, right? And you think about technology adoption. we would do we would fund a lot of basic and or applied research to develop a technology, and then the government, when I came in, my office was supposed to speak externally. I'm like, where is our CMO, right? Where is our chief marketing officer? I wanted to hire, and I actually wrote out this whole thing about hiring a CMO. We need somebody whose job is to get the word out, to liaison with the private sector. And instead, the concept that we had was, oh, we'll have policy people, and on their free time, they'll set up events and go to and arrange the SEC meetings that we were talking about, Clif. But that's not their skill set, and that's why you see, the government is notorious for running on PowerPoint and putting out terrible graphics, and their answer to having to working with the private sector is to give some random email box or a phone number that you never know who is on the other end of answering the call, right? The pivot that we need to make as we generationally change in the federal government, which is what we're doing right now, right? The average age of a federal employee is 57. So as the new generation comes in, we need to utilize technology to bring in a marketing component to get across that gap. Because the technologies that we create turn into shelfware, where it's a great product.
And Sean, though, the one of the other reasons they turn into shelfware, apart from lack of marketing, is lack of engineering. So I think we have researchers who are PhDs who are wonderful at creating these really inspiring demos, right? They show the way, but they are not products, and they cannot perform at scale. And there's only a few companies in the world, there's a few dozen companies in the world that really understand what it means to perform at scale. Like we had to provide services to a huge intelligence agency. So scale was just table stakes, day one. And that took 4 years to scale up to industrial grade. And like my chief engineer says, you can't just get a bunch of developers together, right? When you want to build a bridge, you don't just take a bunch of bricks and stack them up by the river, right? You need engineering for that. And I think that there's the Silicon Valley myth of we'll just do MVP and we'll be on Mountain Dew and no-dos and come up with something, it'll be awesome. But we really need engineering for things that are going to scale. And I think that is the bigger gap than lack of marketing, because you do this great marketing on stuff that's just demoware, you're going to have a lot of disappointed people. Well, so I think having that product test passed is important.
I just think I gotta double down on what Sean said. When I was in the federal government, I saw huge opportunities. I mean, the resources of the federal government and so forth are outstanding. But I even found organizations like Homeland Security who couldn't deploy their own stuff. Okay, because one of the big challenges is Sean's point, they don't know how to communicate. Okay, I mean, I went to the Hill and talked to the budget committees and so forth, and they said, here, Clif, you can have all the money you freaking want. I mean, we've never heard anybody actually tell us why they want the money. Okay, they just want the money, and since we don't know why, we don't give it to you. So since they communicate so poorly, they don't have the resources, they don't have the talent, the staff, or even the money to do anything in advance. I mean, they're just, like you said, trying to keep the milk fresh. Okay, and they fail at that. So let alone go buy some wine. That is not going to happen. So if they can't learn to communicate and put it into some kind of mission statement, how it relates back to the mission, they're not going to get it. This isn't unique to the government. I mean, corporations have exactly the same problem. But how to communicate the value, not only today, but tomorrow, because they do live a little bit today. And you have to put your problem statement in today and tomorrow and help put that business case for them, because they cannot communicate. They make lousy PowerPoints. They don't know how to get in the minds of the audience.
Well, and they're also trying to figure out how to fund FTEs, right? So if the procurement model is how do we maximize the number of defense contractors and integrators on task, you're not going to get a high scale solution. Right? It's perverse, right? It's no way incentivized. So I think we have to look at the productization of things. And like Sean said, right, you want a SaaS that scales and you want to see ARRs, and you want to see things where if customers aren't happy, they can switch, right? Because that tells you that a market can actually work. And so I think that figuring out how to buy versus necessarily make everything from scratch, which we'd love to do in the federal government, that's really important. How do we build on success?
All right, so let me hop in real quick here. Certainly that topic is one where this panel and myself included could go on for hours on that particular topic. Certainly part of Cyber Capital Partners is to participate in the DoD Trusted Capital Marketplace as a cybersecurity venture firm. And the reason we do that is there is enormous gaps between the government and industry, and that need to facilitate that public-private partnership is really a core mission of Cyber Capital Partners. We're at 12:57. I'm mindful of our audience's time. I want to hand it over to Ian and have him do the wrap-up, but I please ask everybody, fill out the survey. It will be very helpful for us, and it will be a pathway for us to get a chance to talk with you guys as well. So thank you very much to the panel. Great insights. I think you guys are all brilliant. And looking forward to working with you guys again in the near future here. So Ian, the floor is yours.
Well, thank you so much, Jason, and thank you to everybody, JC, Sean, Cliff, thank you all. We've got more questions than we can answer. Obviously, there's a lot of interest around this, and we'll keep those conversations going after today's event. And just as a broader reminder to our audience, today's broadcast is being recorded and a copy will be made available on request. And I highly, highly encourage you, as Jason just said, to complete the event survey, which we will be sending in an email this afternoon. And I'm going to be once again bringing back now our colleague Kilty Mahoney for closing remarks.
Thanks again, Ian. As we close today from ShareNett, huge thank you to Jason, JC, Sean, and Cliff. Fantastic panel. And thank you to Cavendish Global, our monthly event partner, for helping us to produce today's event. Please, everyone, save the date for our upcoming ShareNett Cavendish events, including next Thursday, April 22nd, when we have Charlie Hammerman presenting on his nonprofit work through the Disability Opportunity Fund, and also on Wednesday, May 19th. Please join ShareNett right back here for our next panel event with a new focus on consumer technology. Look for the RSVP links that will be heading over to your inbox, and we hope to see you there. Hope you've enjoyed today's event. Huge thank you again to all who participated for joining us.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you. It's a pleasure.